Coming back to the people side of our business, our next session will focus on a topic that will impact many of us, but probably isn't the first thought when it comes to personal finance. That's how does Alzheimer's impact investors and their families, and what can be done to prepare and support those affected? Leading this important discussion is John Berline. John is a retired general partner for Edward Jones in St. Louis. Another alum, John also earned his MBA from Washington University in 1977. He's a past member of the Board of Governors of the St. Louis Society of Financial Analysts, and he served on the investment committee of Drury's Board of Trustees and was chairman of the board from 2006 to 2010. John was inducted into the Breach Hall of Fame in February of 2008 and was awarded honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Drury in 2013. John is married to Crystal, and they have 3 children, Sarah, Marie, Robin Whitney, and Jonathan Danner. John, thank you so much for being here to lead this very important discussion.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate you setting us up and setting the stage for us. And a warm welcome to everyone who's joining the program. I'm going to guess that a lot of you in our audience are like me, that you're numbers oriented. So allow me to feed that for you for a couple of minutes here. I was reading last week in a release from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, that 6 in 10 adults in the United States have a chronic disease. And it's the majority over the age of 21 have a chronic disease. And it is 8 in 10 for adults over the age of 85. And if you take a look even deeper, 4 in 10 of those folks over the age of 65 have more than one chronic illness. The odds are even higher for minorities. You know, the big 7 chronic diseases include heart disease, cancer, lung disease, stroke, diabetes, and kidney disease. And the one we're here to talk about today, Alzheimer's, would round out the group. So amazingly, if you're watching and you don't have a chronic disease, then this is one of those rare times when you can be happy to be a minority. It is a $4 trillion problem for the country. I'd go on to add to that in 2021, national survey conducted by the good folks at AgeWave out in California, their national survey discovered that Alzheimer's was identified as the single most feared of all the chronic diseases of the big 7. And the reason for that is, unlike the other 6 chronic diseases, where there are actually some improvements in the death per diagnosis ratio, there is no cure for Alzheimer's or widely available treatment for the disease. And for that reason, Alzheimer's has become the single most expensive disease in the country. So, you know, as a financial advisor, advising individual investors, it's imperative that any long-term financial plan that you might be developing for someone on how to manage should include how to manage the impact of a chronic disease, because the odds are that a member or possibly has one or possibly more than one chronic disease. Ed may have said this earlier, but we are going to be taking questions in the second half of the program. So go on chat and ask them, and Ed's going to be watching for those. But the first part of the program, actually, we've got a starstruck panel. Ed mentioned that I was an honorary doctor. I assure you, all the other 3 members of this panel have earned their degrees. We have Dr. Joanne Pike here, the president of the Alzheimer's Association. I'll introduce her or toss the ball to her in just a second. And then we have Dr. Eric McDade, sorry, Eric, who is one of the key scientists over at the Knight Center for Alzheimer's Research. And he's in the midst of all the great research that's being done there. And then we have Dr. Nancy Morrill-Howell, nationally recognized gerontologist, led that association for a number of years, and is a national authority on how to keep older Americans engaged. So I'm going to go first to Dr. Pike, and congratulations, Joanne, for, this is your first year as the president of the National Association. I know you've spent 5 years as the national strategist for the association. 13 years prior to that with the American Cancer Society. And I know you've got a relationship with the American Diabetes and the American Heart Association. So working with philanthropic organizations has been your calling in life, but now you've been called to the Alzheimer's Association, and we'd love for you to share with us some of the history behind the breadth and depth of this national as well as global problem. Joanne?
Thank you. And John, let me start off by expressing our gratitude and how grateful we are really for your leadership and support to launch our work together in 2016 when Edward Jones really stepped out as the first national presenting sponsor for the Alzheimer's Association's Walk to End Alzheimer's, which is held annually in more than 600 communities nationwide. And really since then, we've seen just an explosion of support from Edward Jones. 85,000 participants have walked under the Edward Jones banner, and the firm and its associates have raised more than $30 million for the fight to end Alzheimer's. So thank you again for your leadership and Edward Jones' leadership. And our work at the Alzheimer's Association certainly leads the way to end Alzheimer's and all of the dementia. Our mission is to accelerate global research, drive risk reduction and early detection, and maximize quality care and support. And Edward Jones has continued to really enhance the association's care and support programs, as well as provide educational materials for Edward Jones clients and associates through things like the 10 warning signs online, education programs, and joint educational webinars. The firm has also advanced public policy through our Alzheimer's Impact Movement, our corporate program, and continues to accelerate vital research toward methods of treatment, prevention, and ultimately a cure, including something that I imagine Dr. McDade might talk a little bit about today through the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. But I would dive into some of those numbers that you mentioned. Our facts and figures report that we publish annually really details and highlights the burden of Alzheimer's and dementia on individuals, caregivers, government, and the nation's healthcare system overall. In the United States alone, more than 6 million people are living with Alzheimer's. The size of the US population age 65 and older continues to grow, especially as we see those baby boomers age into this population group. And as we see that population group grow, as the baby boomers continue to age, so will the numbers and the proportion of Americans with Alzheimer's and other dementias. More than 11 million Americans provide unpaid care also for people with Alzheimer's or another dementia. In 2022, Alzheimer's and other dementias are going to cost the nation $321 billion total. And it's projected that by 2050, these costs could reach nearly $1 trillion. Now, these are just a few highlights that I mentioned, but I also want to go into who is at the greatest burden, who has the greatest risk. The fact is almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. In addition, older Black Americans are about twice as likely to have Alzheimer's or another dementia as older whites, and older Hispanic Americans are about 1.5 times as likely to have Alzheimer's or another dementia as older whites as well. You talk about the financial burden, especially on investors. The cost of Alzheimer's is astronomical. I mentioned the cost to the nation at the total level, but the fact is individuals bear this cost as well. Alzheimer's is one of the most expensive diseases that we see, with a lifetime cost of care of more than $370,000. That's someone's retirement. That's a college education that they may have promised their grandkids, or inheritance. 70% of those lifetime costs are really borne also by family caregivers, whether that's in the form of unpaid caregiving or out-of-pocket expenses. That could range from medication to food for people with dementia. The cost of all of these items and the way it impacts caregivers can impact finances in a number of ways. It could be about just paying for care, but it also could be about lost opportunities as well. Because of the intense amount of time people spend providing care, caregiving can affect a person's ability to be employed. Many caregivers end up cutting hours, taking time off, retiring early, or having to quit their jobs. And these decisions mean lost income, more debt, difficulty saving for retirement, or having to cut back on expenses or costs or ways to save. Caregiving really manages and impacts someone's ability to manage financial challenges as well. It's going to impact their own health due to high levels of burden, exhaustion, certainly uncertainty and stress that are created. And ultimately, when caregivers are unable to take care of the health of themselves, it can cause their own medical expenses as well. Now, the Alzheimer's Association does think about from the standpoint of these financial burdens of what can we do? How can we help individuals? And we recently launched a new education program focused on financial awareness called Managing Money: A Caregiver's Perspective on Finances. And one of the key areas of the program really teaches a few simple things caregivers can do, especially when you think about reducing the risk of financial abuse and fraud. A couple of those things I might highlight just are like working with individuals on what safety measures they can put in place together, setting up auto pay for bills instead of paying them by check. And most banks will do this for them or work with you. Signing up to receive automatic notifications for withdrawals from bank accounts that are large, or if charges on credit cards get too big. If you set up a charge or a spending limit and a person spends more than that, the bank or a credit card can let you know. So it's these simple acts that we try and teach in this education program to make sure families and caregivers have the skills and knowledge to help combat some of these fraud situations that can happen. One of the things I might highlight, though, John, before turning it back over to you, is just 3 ways that the association and the US government are working to support Alzheimer's and all other dementia. First is through nationwide and state level advocacy. We work with and have a separately incorporated advocacy affiliate called the Alzheimer's Impact Movement, where we assemble and train a nationwide network of advocates to use their voice to pass critical pieces of legislation to really engage elected officials and certainly look at things like research funding. We helped pass landmark legislation such as the National Alzheimer's Project Act, which is mandated to create a national plan to fight Alzheimer's and coordinates efforts towards its first goal to prevent and effectively treat the disease by 2025. We recently also are working to expand that from 2025 to 2035 through a reauthorization act right now. We're also strengthening the federal government's commitment to Alzheimer's research following a $289 million increase that was signed into law in March of 2022, adding to the current NIH spend. Annual federal funding for Alzheimer's research is now more than $3.4 billion. That's a 7-fold increase in less than a decade that we've seen enhance the NIH spending on Alzheimer's research. The second way that we really work together is through care and support. The association provides care and support for all those who are affected by Alzheimer's and other dementia. And it's important to know that we're here to help anyone who may need us through our free nationwide 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week helpline that is staffed by master's level clinicians and specialists, really providing confidential support and information to anybody who is affected, and it's available in over 200 languages. We also conduct face-to-face and virtual support groups and education programs in communities nationwide, really to ensure that those services can reach people where they are needed and how they need that support. And then last, I would highlight the work that we do with research. We are the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research globally. The association is committed to accelerating global progress towards methods of treatment, prevention, and ultimately a cure. The Alzheimer's Association invests and supports drug treatment development, lifestyle intervention to reduce risk, and early detection of dementia through the validation of biological markers, biomarkers that can advance how we detect this disease. And today, the Alzheimer's Association is investing $300 million in 920 active best of field projects in 45 countries spanning 6 continents. But I'd be remiss without mentioning our strong research connection between the Alzheimer's Association and Washington University as well. Over the years, the association has awarded 64 grants to Washington University, totaling $54 million. So John, I'd turn it back over to you to see if there's anything else that you want to do with the panel too.
Yeah, Joanne, I was taken with your comment about the lifetime costs of Alzheimer's being $370,000. I was also online the other night, and I was looking for what the average person has at retirement age in this country, and it's less than $70,000 average person. My guess is a lot of the folks watching this program are working with folks with resources well in excess of that. But it does point out the insidious risk that Alzheimer's can be on the next generation, because if the parents can't afford to live and spend another $370,000 on Alzheimer's care, who's going to pay that bill if not the next generation? And that's one of also in the age wave research study that was done. One of the greatest fears that most folks who go into financial planning have is getting some chronic disease and then becoming dependent upon their children. They don't want to become dependent on their children. So what the services that and the research that the Alzheimer's Association does, you mentioned is vitally important, but you mentioned that largest independent underwriter of research on the globe beyond, is it the United States and China? They would be bigger than us, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The US government and the Chinese government are the only two funders of Alzheimer's research that are larger than the Alzheimer's Association. We're quite proud of the work that we do in the research space. And just to drive the connection closer, we're really proud of the connection we have with Washington University and the work that I'm assuming you're probably going to hear from Dr. McDade about with the Diane-2 trial as well.
We're going to go to him next, but I have one final question. You've got over a 20-year career in the healthcare industry. Have you ever seen a disease get the kind of attention that the National Institute of Health is sending? I mean, a 7-fold increase in what, the last 8 years or so. Is that unparalleled in terms of the history of National Institute of Health funding?
It seems like it would be to me. Quite honestly, it is a huge investment and something that sends a signal. And I think it sends a signal also from our policymakers who make those decisions and NIH overall. This is an important issue. It's one of the only diseases without a cure, without a prevention. And while we have a new treatment, we need more in the pipeline, certainly.
Well, thank you for that. Don't go away. I'm sure we'll be back to you as people ask questions. So thank you for that. And let's turn our attention to Eric McDade. Dr. Eric McDade is a professor of neurology at Washington University. And like Joanne, he's got a rich history of wrestling with this disease at the University of Maryland, University of Pittsburgh. He's at the Mayo Clinic. Thankfully, he's one of ours at Washington University at the Knight Center for Alzheimer's research. Eric, for some folks who may not be that familiar with the disease, can you talk about maybe where it was 10, 15 years ago in terms of our scientific effort and where it is to now?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you, John, very much. And thanks, Ed, for the opportunity. I want to reiterate the point made by Joanne to you, John, for the incredible support that you have shown personally and on behalf of Edward Jones for the advocacy for this nationwide, but here obviously at WashU, which I've personally benefited from significantly. So it really is a great opportunity and honor to be here today to speak with you and the rest of the panel and to the attendees today. So I have a unique perspective in that from the time that I've really come into practice and really spent most of my time doing this, the field has exploded. So I've been, I would say, a card-carrying dementia neurologist now for just over a decade. And I've been able to witness some really dramatic things that have happened in the field. And if we go back to when I started medical school in early 2000, at that time, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease still relied primarily on, if you really wanted to make a formal diagnosis, that this required taking a look at somebody's brain after they passed away. So leading up to that point, diagnoses were made primarily on the history that you could obtain within the clinic from an individual as well as their family members who provided you that information. And we could be pretty good, but there was often some guesswork that would go into that. And that had a major impact on things that we would do, including clinical trials, where it was identified that up to about a third of people that would come into a clinical trial that was for Alzheimer's disease, if you actually went back, almost a third of those individuals didn't have Alzheimer's disease. So that immediately handicapped a huge amount of the clinical trials that we've been doing for decades, and it probably hampered advancements in the field. And starting about 15 years ago, there was the development of an ability to actually look at the brain while somebody's alive and see if there were one of the hallmark pathologies, the amyloid plaques within the brain. And over the ensuing decade, we've gone from using a PET scan, which is a very specialized tool that's only available in certain medical centers. It's very costly, to going to dramatic advancements in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is much more accessible, but requires a lumbar puncture, which is a spinal tap is the term that many people are familiar with, to most recently with the discovery here at WashU of a blood test. So a blood test that can identify whether or not somebody accurately identify whether or not somebody has evidence of amyloid plaques in their brain. And this has dramatically shaped and altered the landscape of the field during the last 10 to 15 years, because it allows us to now track the disease in a much more specific way than we've ever been able to do. And in doing so, it really has allowed us to understand what we had suspected for many years, but weren't able to accurately identify, that Alzheimer's disease is a chronic disorder. It's something that occurs over decades. It doesn't occur overnight. And it's also something that's not inevitably a part of aging. So we oftentimes, Alzheimer's disease was initially referred to as senile dementia, meaning that it was associated with senility, with aging, and oftentimes seen as this sort of benign process. So the advancements that we've made with diagnoses have really now allowed us to have more accurate clinical trials and to understand how the disease unfolds in a much more comprehensive way, which allows us to not only target things like amyloid plaques and these tau tangles, those are the core pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, but they also allow us to understand the contributors to what makes the brain resistant to these pathologies, or what makes it more susceptible to these pathologies, and identify a number of risk factors that occur and unfold over our lifetimes, in fact, actually. So this revolution in the diagnosis has changed things completely in our field, and it really has been a critical movement for us. And that advancement in the early diagnosis of things really can't be understated as well, because even though we still have a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of to do in coming up with very effective therapies to prevent and to treat the disease, making an early diagnosis has a significant impact on people who have the disease as well as their families, because one, it allows for decision making. The earlier you make a decision or a diagnosis, the greater the autonomy the person who's experiencing the symptoms can then continue to make decisions about how they want to continue to live their life, including financial decisions, which have a major impact on people. It allows individuals in the earliest stages to actually identify reversible causes, which are likely to have a more higher impact on slowing the disease down. So if an individual, for instance, is taking a medication that may cause some cognitive impairment, this allows them to remove that medication and slow things down. If they have evidence of sleep apnea, which may accelerate the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's disease, it allows them to treat that. If they have certain exposures, like they're drinking too much alcohol, for instance, it allows them to make changes. And the other important thing of the advancements in the diagnosis and making an early diagnosis is that as new therapies do come out, including the most recently approved therapy, it's very likely that therapies introduced earlier in the process are more likely to have a significantly beneficial effect if they're introduced at an earlier stage of the disease. So as I said, this unfolds over decades. So when we actually see the symptoms in people who are around us, and when I see people in the clinic, they're actually at the end stage in many ways of a process that's been going on for 10 to 15 years. And the earlier we can identify as people on that pathway, the more likely we are to have an impact on slowing it down with both therapeutics as well as with lifestyle management.
Well, Eric, you're holding back on us. You're not telling us the whole story because you're a trailblazer. I know you're involved in a pretty exciting new first time ever clinical trial. Can you talk about that? In fact, you're leading the trial, are you not?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is on the shoulders of giants. So this is work that, I think in many ways started here with John Morris, over 3 decades ago, and identifying that Alzheimer's disease was something that developed over time and not just overnight. And that led to Randy Bateman to really identify an opportunity with a rare form of Alzheimer's disease in these families that have this really horrible genetic cause of Alzheimer's disease, which causes an early onset form of the disease, but a predictable onset, which allows us actually to enroll these individuals and determine when it is likely that they're going to develop the disease, and subsequently to develop first-time prevention therapies. So Dr. Bateman started this thing called the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network Trials Unit. It launched its first trials in 2012, which included asymptomatic, so people who were at risk but didn't have symptoms, as well as those with mild symptoms. And I've taken up the torch, and we're actually going to be starting a trial which has received substantial funding from the NIA as well as the Alzheimer's Association, and important philanthropic contributions from the Knight family here in St. Louis to launch this trial, where we'll be introducing amyloid therapies. So a therapy that targets the amyloid plaque in individuals up to 2.5 decades before we think they're going to get the disease. And this is going to be in people in their 20s and 30s. So we're going to be starting a prevention study that likely will go on for 6 to 10 years to see if we prevent amyloid plaques from developing, or if we reverse them at the very earliest stages, the impact that will have on the whole disease unfolding. And it's because of these families that we're able to do this, and because of the amazing research center here at WashU that's been able to set this up. So we hope that although this is in a very rare form of the disease, that this will allow us actually to very efficiently run a trial that would be very, very difficult to run in the normal population, because of the millions of people at risk. You have to identify who are the ones who actually are in the right stage of the disease to introduce these therapies. So this offers us a very unique opportunity to kind of blaze this trail and determine, like cardiovascular disease, will we be treating Alzheimer's disease for people potentially in their midlives if they're at a high enough risk? And it's through trials like this will allow us to determine the best way to move forward with that.
Well, Eric, one of the things that your clinical trials depend upon are people participating in the clinical trial. Do you feel like you have enough of those folks, or we've got financial advisors watching today who are coming into contact with families who may have a history of this? Could they do anything to help you get a broader, deeper pool of participants?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point, John. So absolutely, I think although these families that we recruit for this specific trial are very rare, if an individual's financial planner happens to be working with a family that says, I know Alzheimer's is in my family, for instance, so I'm coming to you at this stage of my life because I really want to set up a financial plan that takes us into account and potentially protects all of our assets and These are families that absolutely we want to know of, and there are programs like the Trial Match program through the Alzheimer's Association, which knows of clinical trials and knows of research efforts that are similar to this. And even if it's not one of these rare forms of Alzheimer's disease, we know that probably about 80% of Alzheimer's disease is genetic related. And we know if there's a family history, there's a higher risk of subsequent generations developing it. So any family history actually allows us to do critical research in identifying how the genetics of Alzheimer's disease unfolds within families. And so absolutely, I think we're always looking for research participants to participate in these research studies, either in clinical trials or in observational studies that allow us to understand how the disease unfolds. And we even have a program here that John Morris started called the Adult Children Study. And it's specifically a research study for families who have Alzheimer's in their family and can participate starting in their mid-40s actually to undergo research participation.
Very good. Very good. Well, you don't go away either. We're going to invite Nancy to chime in next. But if anybody has any questions, please go on the chat and ask them, and we will wrestle with those just as soon as we have Dr. Nancy Morrill Howell, who is at the Brown School at Washington University. She is the head of the Center for Aging at the Brown School, and has been very engaged throughout her career in the area of gerontology. In fact, once led the National Association of Gerontologists. Nancy's she just has practical considerations for how to deal with people who are living with Alzheimer's disease. So Nancy, delighted to have you as part of our program today.
Thank you, John. Thanks, John, sorry, I'm going to be a little froggy today. I have a sore throat. Thanks, John, for your commitment to Alzheimer's disease, and my wildest appreciation to Joanne and Eric for the important work that they're doing. As John said, I'm a social worker, and I have ideas to share about communicating and working with people with dementia and their family members. It comes from that perspective. Communication is clearly the key to all of our work. It's our key to successful relationships with our clients, with our family, with persons with dementia, and with caregivers. So I appreciate taking a few minutes to talk about some lessons I've learned as a gerontological social worker, and I think they're relevant to professionals in the financial industry. A very important word to us is empowerment, and all of us want to exercise power in our daily lives. We want to be in control of things that matter to us, and we resist, and we're not pleasant if that is threatened. And dementia, like many chronic diseases, threatens our competence and our power to make decisions and control our lives. So a big challenge to all of us is to empower people whose competencies and controls are shrinking. And remember, as Eric and Joanne have implied, the course of this disease is long, and there are stages, and there are communication strategies for every stage. So some of the lessons I've learned are easier to apply in the first part of the disease rather than the last part, but apply to caregivers and their families throughout this long course. Excuse me. So how do we empower people? Well, we include them in decision-making, even in the most constrained of circumstances. How can we create choice, find choice, offer choice, engage in discussions of options, of pros and cons, discussing head-on hesitancies and feelings? To discuss the consequences of one path over another is a very important discussion for persons with dementia and their caregivers. We also empower people by talking directly to them, to the person with the illness, even in the face of dementia for as long as possible. May we all go past the point where many others have stopped trying to speak directly to people. My mother was mildly cognitively impaired at the time of her death. but very slow and very hard of hearing. And every therapist, every dentist, every doctor, every shoe salesman person went right around her to me. And of course, that was faster. And of course, that yielded maybe the right or the best answer earlier, but it is at the price of dignity to that person. And it is also at the expense of that person accepting and living with very hard decisions. So in other words, it pays off the extent to which we can take the time to talk directly and to include people. Eventually, people with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias are going to need to rely on others to speak for them. But if we can just remember how important it is to us to always retain our power, maybe we can do that. There's an old expression from the disabilities community, nothing about us without us. And how do we implement that in the face of dementia and with caregivers is very important. The second fundamental point is helping people use help. There are the Alzheimer's Association, and Joanne mentioned, just an amazing amount of services. You all need to know how to call that association, how to look that up online, and use their resources. But there is what we call in social work this need-use gap. We don't use services easily. We know that help might be available, but we don't use it. And so maybe it's our obsession with independence, our fear of losing our independence, the stigma of getting help, the stigma of Alzheimer's disease. We all need help, and people with dementia and family caregivers certainly will. But in general, people are bad help seekers. And think about yourself. How often could you have used a counselor, an advisor, a helper of some sort? But we all think, oh, it's easier not to seek help. We'll muddle through, we'll do okay. So how can you help people use help is an important question for you as you're interacting with people with dementia and their caregivers. So just a couple of tips with the time I have. One is there's a long way to go between information and referral and people really using help. So remember, it's more than just the overwhelming amount of resources. It's staggering. You have to stick with people to help them engage, follow through, problem solve, and hopefully finally engage in getting that help. Also, don't be afraid to talk about reluctance. Why are people resistant to a home care aide, to a walker, to a transportation services? There are reasons, some legit, maybe some don't make sense to us, but discuss them. Discuss the fears, the hesitancies. Don't dismiss them. Sometimes we think that by letting people verbalize a hesitancy, we're going to strengthen it. Usually the opposite happens. We weaken the power of an idea by getting to express it and talk it through. So talk about reluctance. And finally, help people use something, maybe even experimentally. Let's try it. Let's agree that you're going to do this for a week. We'll revisit. If it doesn't work, we'll think of something different. Because if people can see something as they'll do something temporarily, they're more likely to try. So the Alzheimer's Association has seen many caregivers who just can't turn over any of the work they do for their person to somebody else. They're very reluctant to use the services that are available. We know that peer support goes a long way. People in that same boat helping each other know about and use services. And the Alzheimer's Association has a lot of peer-to-peer type programs. One last thought before I turn it back to you, John, is extending this idea about reluctant to use services to reluctance to plan. I think that Eric mentioned the importance of planning, but boy, we are all bad at that as well. How can we make planning normal, routine, not weird? To talk about the legal work that we need in place, the preferences for end-of-life care and care preferences. We want those known, we want those documented. It's especially important for people with dementia, but it's important for all of us. as Eric mentioned, earlier and earlier diagnosis is giving that specific warning signs to some of us to get our legal work and our paperwork in order. But lots of times we don't have this warning. So, a goal for all of us is do the planning when you're fine. It's easier. You can have much more honest, life-affirming decision-making discussions with family when you're not in the shock or the sadness of a chronic condition being diagnosed. So hopefully we can all ourselves and help each other and the people we work with plan as early as now. I think I'll stop there, John.
I know you could go on, Nancy, but thank you so much for that. I was struck by your comment that people are bad help seekers, and I think that was recognized in some legislation that was done for our industry, the investment business, when it was encouraged that financial advisors start to collect something called a trusted contact, and when you're setting up an account or you're doing a financial review, to find out who is that person, who's their trusted contact that you can go to if there's questions that you might have about a decision, and that could be exactly the person who could be the one to persuade the individual who's living with the disease to check it out. I would put Eric, you were quick to say, and I know early diagnosis is your specialty. One of the things that we would caution folks about is before you go get that diagnosis, make sure that some of the financial planning around insurance, especially if it's long-term care insurance or some hybrid of that you've got that in place first, because one of the questions that's asked in the interview process to see whether or not you qualify for the coverage is, have you ever been diagnosed with dementia? And if you say yes to that, well, then it could disqualify you from or throw you into a much higher premium category, cause you to be rated by the insurance company. So make sure you get those things in place before you go get the diagnosis. I think that's important. Eric, I wanted you to comment on, I know Washington University gets a lot of money from the National Institute of Health, and you have these very elaborate proposals that you submit. And when you get the award, you have got to follow that proposal from start to finish, no matter what important discoveries you might find along the way that you might say, let's put a stop to this because it looks like it's more promising if we go this direction. You can't do that, can you? But funds from the Alzheimer's Association might allow you to do that.
Yeah, John, it's a critical point. We rely on funding mechanisms from multiple streams, and as was mentioned, the funding through the National Institute of Aging, which is part of the National Institute of Health, has increased dramatically through advocacy, no doubt. And so that's a critical funding opportunity and mechanism for the research that we do. But from the time that I may come up with an idea to submit a proposal to the National Institute of Health, if I start today, for instance, there are only specific cycles which you can submit that research. After you submit that research plan, there's typically about a 3 to 4 month delay before that research plan is reviewed by the reviewers. After that review is done, if it's promising, there may be another 3 to 4 months until you find out if you even get the funding. And then after that, there may be another few months until the actual check comes to the university. So it can be a very slow process, and it can actually hold things up. And like you said, when we go through the National Institute of Health, there are expectations and a bit more rigid. And so we do have to respond to discoveries. We do have to respond to changes, especially now with the explosion in technological advances that allow us to look at the disease in many different ways and to address it in many different ways. And so research through the Alzheimer's Association and philanthropic opportunities, they allow us to take more risks, and they allow us to be a little bit more bold at times and high risk, high reward research is really what we think is going to use to get us through those major breakthroughs. And then the continued funding through the National Institute of Health allows us to continue to chip away and support these large institutions, which we're very much rely on, because this is very much a team sport when it comes to discovery and treatment, not just in the medical school, but it's the Brown School, along with the math department, the chemistry department, the physics department. All of these are contributing. So that flexibility is critical to us.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. Joanne, Ed is telling me that we're getting questions around what other resources does the Alzheimer's Association have to offer. In particular, I know there's an appetite to know what the 800 line is and how accessible it is, and that, can you share some more insight there?
Yeah, would love to. If someone needs additional resources, we certainly are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in two formats. One is through our helpline service. If you want to talk to someone, we have trained social workers available every day, every hour, and that's 1-800-272-3900. Anytime someone wants to speak with someone who's trained and knowledgeable about the disease, any information they may need, crisis assistance or resources that they may need to identify in a community. We also are available on our webpage, alz.org. And we have multiple education programs available online, certainly information if you have questions, but also we offer a live chat service so that when we have staff available, we'll pop that live chat availability there. And I know certainly if you're like me, sometimes that chat functionality is a lot faster than picking up the phone, and we wanted to make sure everybody had access to that. The other key areas on our webpage on alz.org, we have a community resource finder so that if you need a support group, or if you want to go to an education program, or you just want to find some other resources in your community, you can look us up at alz.org/CRF. And you can look at your area by zip code and see what we offer either through our association or through trusted programs in the community.
Yep. Joanne, I know that the association, I think last time I saw, over 70% driven by volunteers. So I know a number of our financial advisors who are watching and participating in this program have conversations from time to time with their clients about, well, you know, what fulfills you and what would you like to do in retirement? And volunteerism is one of the things that oftentimes come up. Would you mind if they recommended that they consider coming to the Alzheimer's Association to volunteer?
We would absolutely not mind that at all. And in fact, volunteers power our mission and our work. We have lots of different types of volunteer opportunities, whether it's through one of those education programs I mentioned, where you could be a trained facilitator about information about the disease or the association, or whether it's you want to get involved in raising funds and fighting back locally. We can connect you to whatever it is that you would like to do. We certainly also use our advocates and volunteers to urge legislators to make a change in this disease and make it a national priority. So we have advocacy opportunities available as well. And then we also offer certainly the ability, even if you want to volunteer in a more passive way, to register for Trial Match that you heard Dr. McDade talk about, where you can sign up to be available for clinical studies and see if you match to one of them yourself.
Mm-hmm. And did you go right on the Alzheimer's site to find that?
Absolutely, alz.org, or even contacting our helpline at 1-800-272-3900, when we can always make a connection on volunteer opportunities locally or getting involved within our mission.
I know that the association has a relationship with an organization called Engage for Good, which is kind of one of these organizations out of Chicago, like yourself, who celebrate organizations. You mentioned Edward Jones' involvement in the Alzheimer's Association, where they do good by doing good. And I would point out that there's been some research to suggest that getting involved in a cause-based marketing program like Alzheimer's is actually good for your business, for those folks who are interested in driving client loyalty scores, we at Edward Jones have over the years followed the Net Promoter Score, and we've noticed that there's like a 15, 16 point lift in loyalty scores from clients who know that their financial advisors are engaged in supporting the Alzheimer's Association than those that don't. That is a significant way to drive loyalty and do good by doing good in your community. So highly recommend people consider donating not only their time and talents to the association for the #1 most feared disease that your clients are facing. Certainly the one with the greatest financial impact on not only them, but their caregivers and the next generations. And actually, inherently a good thing to do, but it's actually good for your business at the same time. Any final comments that anyone would like to make? Nancy, can I come to you for a final comment?
Well, I think that we've talked about a lot of stuff. The Alzheimer's Association is just the top of the line for giving services, and the research going on this disease is just the best on the globe right now. I do want to point out, though, that most of us won't get a dementing illness. It's the scariest, but we have to also talk about the other side of things so that we're not making everybody afraid. We want people to take all the actions that we talked, to plan, because anything could happen to us. And we need to do our planning, and we need to promote health and prevent, but there's a lot of things that are in our control. And some of the more focus that's been happening is even around Alzheimer's disease, is how lifestyle matters, how behavior matters, how engagement and purposeful activity matters. All of those things we can do for ourselves and for our family members and our clients to really extend the healthiest part of life that we have ahead of us. So I just kind of want to end on that little bit brighter note of what we can do in our own lives to stay as healthy as we can for a long time.
Well, thank you for the lift at the end, Nancy. Eric, any final comments from you, sir?
Yeah, just briefly, John, I'll touch on that. And actually a couple of the comments that you made is that, with the awareness of Alzheimer's comes a new way that we think about the disease too. And I think, in this platform here, it allows us to let the attendees know, as financial planners, actually, they can actually play a significant role here. And with awareness, recommending things like you said, if somebody's coming up on retirement, there's evidence to show that cognitively enhancing and enriching activities in midlife is actually one of the best protectors against developing the disease. So when they're coming up on that time, it gives you an opportunity to say, what really drives you and what you should be doing when you retire. And the other thing too, when you're thinking about planning and you have family members coming, particularly children of individuals who may have dementia, we have things now like direct-to-consumer genetic tests. Many of you know things like 23andMe. And if you get that 23andMe test and one of your clients decides to get that, and it's identified that they have a risk gene for Alzheimer's disease, and they talk to their physician about that, that suddenly can be part of the medical record. So advising people when they're thinking about, what are best ways to protect, the advisors actually can say, hey, before you maybe get that genetic test, think about, here's some steps I think maybe we should take ahead of time in case that information ever ends up in your medical record. So we all play a role here, from physicians to financial advisors to advocates, in raising awareness and dealing with it as well. So I'll end there.
Yeah, so happy you made that point. Thank you for making that crystal clear. Joanne, we're going to give you the last word.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to really talk about how we raise awareness. Certainly, the Alzheimer's Association is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at alz.org or a helpline. But I also want to just mention, as we enter the summer months and end out May and go into June, June is Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. And worldwide, more than 55 million people are living with Alzheimer's or another dementia. The more we talk about it, the more we are able to share our stories or our experience, the less stigma there is with the disease overall. And I would encourage all of us to think about how we can raise our voice together to raise more awareness, but also inspire action. So thank you for today.
Well, thank you, Joanne and Eric and Nancy, for dedicating your lives to making the world a better place. A lot of us on the panel, watching the panel, are dedicated to creating healthy wealths for our outlooks for our clients. You all create healthy health, more healthy health. And that's what most people who are facing retirement talk about. It's their health or their wealth. Very important, as Dr. McDade said, to integrate both the medical side of this and the financial side of this to give the clients the best possible experience.